We also, there we go. We also will be taking questions in the chat function today. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat function. I'll be actively monitoring it throughout the course of the presentation. And then we'll have some time at the very end for some questions. We ask that everybody please keep their lines muted. If you're dialing in, please make sure that your actual cell phone is muted. And then before I turn things over officially, I just want to put in a plug for our part 2 training. So if you could hit the next slide. We'll be doing a deep dive into email communication on August 12th. So if you haven't already registered, please make sure you do. Without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Ali Ramini, our grassroots manager, who's going to kick things off.
Hi all, thanks Annie. My name is Ali Rahimi and I'm the Grassroots Advocacy Manager for Voices for Healthy Kids. My role is to help campaigns with grassroots strategies through accessing grassroots networks and providing technical assistance. And today I'll be providing a high-level overview of the grassroots component of the Power Prism. Next slide, please. So before we dive deeper into the topic of digital advocacy, I want to touch on grassroots. As Nick will mention later on, there are many parts that make up an advocacy program, and one of those parts is people. And the grassroots and key contacts tool of the Power Prism will help you understand the important role that people play in an advocacy program and how you can leverage people power to drive mission advancement. Next slide. So the first thing I want to touch on is identifying grassroots advocates and the role they play. Grassroots advocates are those who have a connection to elected officials because they are constituents. And hearing from constituents is important to lawmakers because just a handful of letters or phone calls from grassroots advocates can make legislators take notice and act on an issue. Web-based point-and-click action networks should be viewed as a great way to introduce people to the grassroots advocacy. And this rings true now more than ever due to the pandemic, which has led to unprecedented levels of online grassroots advocacy. Your organization can use online networks to help identify grassroots advocates who are willing to take offline action through phone calls, letter writing, and visits to decision makers, although the latter medium is done safer virtually nowadays. Next slide, please. So once you've identified your grassroots advocates, it's important to know how to engage them. And the key to engaging grassroots activists is understanding why they're invested in your issue. What they can share can become a way to transform them to leaders that you rely on to build relationships with decision makers, convey your message to the media, and share their personal stories in support of your issue. Next slide, please. In addition to grassroots advocates, there are also grass tops advocates. Grass tops advocates are the people who, given their special expertise, position, or personal relationships, are more likely to get direct information from a decision maker, or in this case, lawmakers. Grass tops individuals can be cultivated by researching into lawmakers' interests and affiliations and then forming relationships with leaders in those organizations. And you can discover grass tops individuals by asking your grassroots advocates about relationships they may have with decision makers or connected to decision makers. And this is kind of where identifying your network comes in. An organization's mission is greatly enhanced when you can connect volunteers more directly with decision makers and the opinion leaders in the community. And in order to do this, you need to familiarize yourself with your network. Your personal relationships with influential individuals across the country can greatly improve your chances of success. And if you know someone on a first name basis, you're a grass tops connection. The questions presented on the slide can help you identify who you know and how you can leverage those connections to reach and influence decision makers. Next slide. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nick Dean, the Director of Digital Strategy at Burness.
Thanks, Ali. That was really helpful. I'm glad to kind of set the tone there. So I'm going to share my screen really quick. All right. Does that look okay for everyone? Great. Well, thanks for having me today. I'm really excited to start with this first session. We're talking about sparking online action. And what I'm going to dive into today is a little bit about strategy, tools, and content. So oftentimes when I say that I work in digital or digital strategy or digital advocacy, sometimes I get blank stares, which really, I mean, it makes a lot of sense because it can sound very buzzwordy. But today I really want to be able to break down the components of a digital advocacy program and get to some of the actual tactics and work that gets done in digital advocacy and how it can be really helpful in driving change. So that's what we're going to be covering today. As Annie said at the top of the call today, we're talking parts of a digital advocacy program and then the best practices for some of those parts. And then on August 12th, I'll be back and I'll be doing a deep dive on writing and planning for email advocacy. As you'll see today, email advocacy and email work is a big part of digital advocacy work. It's one of the most successful, more popular ways of driving action online. So I thought it would be helpful if we went deeper there as part two. So to get us started, I like to start by saying what makes up an online advocacy program. You think about tweets, you think about emails, you might think about tools, maybe you've heard of different programs that have worked. To Ali's point, you might be thinking about letters to representatives. To be honest, it's all of it. And it gets pretty, the thing about digital communications is it falls into communications, it falls into advocacy, it starts to fall into data. And so it can be somewhat hard to kind of understand what is all of this. But I've broken it down into 5 different parts: tools, content, calendar, people, and then your ladder of engagement. We're going to talk about tools, content, calendar, and people today. We're not going to get into the ladder of engagement, though I'll talk about it a little bit right now. But starting from left to right, so tools, this is the thing that actually helps us get our work done. This is the software we're signing into. This is the, if you work when we work with voices, we use a tool called Phone to Action. This is the email tool, the SMS tool, the stuff that actually gets our content in front of our advocates. Content is what we're saying to them. It's the words we're putting on the screen and how we're talking to them. And one thing I'll say is you can have the world's best tools, but if you don't have great content, it's not going to go very far. Calendar. So we have to be thinking about the calendar of our advocates and of ourselves. What are we working towards? What dates are important? But also, how are our advocates living and what are their lives like right now and what are we going into? When we talk to people, when we talk to advocates, we're not talking to them in a silo. We know things about them and we should use that to our advantage in thinking about calendaring our work. And then people, who are these people? So we talk a lot about lists. It's very common in the digital space to kind of dehumanize people, honestly, calling them users or things like that. And I think Ali did a really great job in calling out how important people are to all of this. There is no online advocacy program without people offline on the other side of the screens actually engaging and doing the work. And lastly, that ladder of engagement that we won't touch on fully today. I just want to talk a little bit about this strategy. So the example I use all the time when thinking about a ladder of engagement is that you wouldn't ask a stranger on the street to help you move. So if you're moving, we've all been asked by our friends and family to help move before. We know how exhausting it can be and tiring it can be and how dreadful it can be. I remember when I was back in college, I got asked all the time to help people move. And we had to be good friends for me to say yes. I use that as an analogy to say a digital and an online advocacy program has to have a ladder of engagement where we are slowly building a relationship with the people on the other side of the screens, where we are thinking about what they'll be willing to do next, and that we're bringing them along, telling them the story, giving them updates, involving them in the process, so that when we make asks, it doesn't seem like the metaphorical ask to help me to move when you've never met me before. So a ladder of engagement is that strategy. It is how would someone move through your digital advocacy program from never heard of you to doing the highest bar thing you could ever ask for them to do. Maybe that's give money to your organization. Maybe that's send a letter. Maybe that's show up to a hearing. Maybe that's write an op-ed or a letter to the editor. There are a ton of different asks that we have of people. And that ladder of engagement allows us to be strategic about how we get people from point A to point Z in our program. So first up in kind of deep diving into the parts of an advocacy program is tools. So for our purposes today, really there are 3 big categories. There are email tools. These are tools that allow us to send emails to our advocates and to store emails and to store the action that people take within their emails. So if you received an email asking you to sign a petition, how do we know you opened it? How do we know you clicked it? How do we know which ones did better than others? We have an email tool, and we use that. An SMS tool allows us to do that similar thing, but with text messages. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the success in text messages, especially in the nonprofit space recently, and why I've included that here. But an SMS tool can help you get the right text messages with links and other things in front of your advocates. And then finally, for today's purposes, we're going to talk about digital advocacy tools. So these are the tools that allow you to easily get advocates to send letters to representatives, get them to make calls, get them to send text messages, get them to share on social. Tools are incredibly important because not all tools are the same, not all tools have the same features, and you have to know your strategy, your campaign strategy, in order to know what tools you need. And sometimes the best tools, though, are the ones that are in front of you. You can hack tools to make them work for what you're trying to do. But if you're just getting started and you have the opportunity to build out your own suite of tools and think about what you really need, knowing your campaign strategy and all of the different asks you're going to make online and how you're going to track people and their involvement and everything you wish for, having that wish list is really important when you're considering the tools that you're going to use. Sometimes these tools are bundled together. So there are a lot of tools out there that are an email tool, an SMS tool, an advocacy tool, all three. Those are great all-in-ones. Other times they are just connected and they talk to each other. So a little bit about Voices for Healthy Kids as an example. I know they use Nation Builder and they use Phone to Action, and they've built a data bridge to have those talk to each other. So an example of how tools can actually work together, and you can customize that. The biggest key is to use a variety of channels to meet advocates where they are. So just to say, you can have one tool. You can have just an email tool and run an entire digital advocacy program on email. You can have just an SMS tool and do that as well. That's really, again, goes back to your strategy. But the biggest key for getting as many people as possible involved is that we are all different. We're all different humans, and we all use the internet and technology differently. So I might respond really well to emails, but I may never respond to a text message. And someone else out there may be completely different, only ever click and do things when I get a text message, literally never check my email, right? And so knowing that people are different and interact with the internet differently, it propels us to think about how can we reach people where they are and on the tools and on the platforms that they're most comfortable using. So I wanted to give a couple examples of tools. Straight email tools, you've probably heard of MailChimp or Constant Contact. MailChimp is growing out to be a marketing program more and more. It has Facebook ads built in, forms, all these other things, but it can also just be, it's very basic, and its kind of origin story is an email tool. You can have lists in the back end of MailChimp, you can design emails, you can send them out, you can track their performance. Same with Constant Contact. So these are simple tools that you might want to consider if you were standing up an advocacy program tomorrow. You could log on to either of these, create an account, and get started. They've got prices varied, and they've got different abilities. Again, you'd want that wish list for your campaign, but I just thought it was weird to talk about tools and not give anyone here any examples. SMS tools, there's really two ways to think about text messaging or SMS tools. The first is what we call broadcast. So I send them the exact same message to 1,000 people, and they all get it and can interact with it, but I can't converse with them. That's just a broadcast SMS tool. And simple texting listed here is one option of a tool that does broadcast messaging. Another more type of texting that's becoming even more popular, especially in the political space, is peer-to-peer text messaging. And so Hustle is an example of a peer-to-peer text messaging tool. What that allows you to do is actually have volunteers who send out individual text messages to people on your SMS list and have conversations with them. You can put in canned responses, you can mark different data information based on those responses. It really allows organizers or volunteers to have hundreds of conversations going at the same time via SMS and talking with them. So there's broadcast and there's peer-to-peer. Both are sending text messages to your supporters and getting them to click on links, take action, tell you more about them, all of those different things. Some combination tools, I talked a little bit about this. Every Action is a combination tool. It has basically every tool I've mentioned in terms of email, I believe they've got some SMS capability. I know they have advocacy capability as well. They're more of a combination tool. Phone to Action, which I've mentioned, is a combination on the other side. It's a digital advocacy tool that also has an SMS capability. So Phone to Action is one that I know Voices for Healthy Kids uses. It is allows you to get advocates to send letters, make phone calls, send text messages, all those kinds of things. And then Action Network is also another suite of tools that has kind of a combination here. So none of these are ringing endorsements for any of these tools. I just wanted to give some examples here of things to consider if you were to stand up an online advocacy program tomorrow. So now that we've talked about tools, kind of the groundwork, I want to dive into content and then calendar next. And before we get into it, I just want to talk a little bit about content and some numbers here. These are from M&R. They do an annual benchmarks report from hundreds of nonprofits who share data in an effort for us to kind of see how the nonprofit industry itself is performing online. So some content numbers here for you. Nonprofits sent an average of 6 email messages per subscriber per month last year, meaning that on average, a subscriber receives 6 emails from an organization. And then this other one is really interesting. Nonprofit text messaging audiences grew by 26% in 2019. So that is a huge growth from the year before. And it's even larger when you think about the other numbers where email lists went down by 2% and Facebook audiences only grew by 4%. So to see a 26% increase in 1 year in text messaging audiences shows you that as an industry, nonprofits and advocacy work is moving and embracing SMS, and clearly that means people are doing well and seeing performance metrics that are really high there. So just kind of an understanding of where people are talking and what kind of content people are creating and how frequently. When we send advocacy emails, some other numbers to consider here, about the average open rate across nonprofits from the year 2019 was about 16%. What this tells me is that you need to send more emails, right? It can often feel, if you're in the space of the campaign or the digital communication staff and you're sending an email, it can feel like you're emailing too much. But when you remember that on average, 16% of the people you sent an email to opened it and everyone else didn't, you suddenly realize, wow, I need to be sending more emails so that I make sure more of my advocates see what we're doing. Everyone is busy. Everyone has a huge email inbox. And so getting that attention is really hard. And so I just wanted to give that industry average there. For advocacy emails, we see a click-through rate about 2.8%, almost 3%. This means that of the people that opened the email you sent, that percentage of people are actually going to click on the thing you asked them to do. Again, when we think about how often we should email and ask, we're really whittling down our numbers here. If we start with 100, and if we say like 50 people are going to open that email, well, we're saying 16 people are going to open that email and 3% of those people are going to click. So it starts to give you a sense of how big you need your audience to be to really start driving change. And then 74% of page completion rate, which it just means that once someone has clicked, they complete the action that you ask them to do. So I just wanted to give these as some simple content metrics to give to base our kind of work in. I also wanted to show them to say, this is why content is so important. It is very hard to get people to take action online. It's awesome. It's a lot of fun. It's rewarding, but it is hard. And people, you are working against numbers that are not always in your favor in terms of the industry standards. For text messages, I just wanted to give a similar update. We see a 9.8% click-through rate. So again, if you're comparing that to emails of a 2.8% click-through rate, another reason to consider SMS in your program if you can. That's a really, really high click-through rate when you compare it to email, almost 3 times as much. And then the subscribe rate is really low at 0.4%, meaning people don't opt out of SMS as much, which is another sticking point. If you can build a great text messaging list, you actually could keep them for a while. Emails unsubscribe rates can go up and down. I think an average of, I think the last average I saw was that a large nonprofit organization would lose about 18% of their email advocates year over year. So that's a lot of churn compared to what we're seeing here for text messages. So now we get to the content, right? We've established the tools. We've talked a little bit about metrics and performance, and suddenly we're like, wow, my content has to be really great if I'm going to perform well and actually drive action online. And so I have a couple best practices when it comes to drafting content. And this is really just to tee up the session on August 12th, where we're going to talk more about writing for email specifically. But I thought it wouldn't be a great session today if I didn't cover any content best practices. So I've just got a couple here and then a few examples. So first is, when you're writing content for your advocacy program, regardless of where you are, if that's an email that you're writing, a Facebook post, a text message, any of that, you really want to make sure that you emphasize exactly what the action you're asking them to take will accomplish, and that you're telling the story. So a consistent mistake advocacy programs make is assuming that advocates are as involved and as invested in following along in the work that they're doing as the sender, like me, is. And I think that's a big mistake. We always want to be putting ourselves in the shoes of our advocates and realizing, do they know why this hearing is important? Maybe I should give this background. Should I make it clear why Tuesday really is the deadline? All of those different things, we can gloss over them because they become second nature to us. And what we really need to emphasize is, like, this action that you're doing right now, this phone call, this email, this tweet, this sharing is really helpful because of X reason. We have to make that connection in all of our content, and we have to tell the story about where we are in the process. And we'll go through an example today where that'll become a little bit more clear. Another content best practice is that you want to be drafting direct messaging, and you really want to make it customizable. So when you're asking someone to send a letter to a representative, you want it to be direct so that the person who's choosing to send or not send is understanding exactly what they're telling their elected representative. I think we can assume sometimes that they're not going to go look at the preloaded message or any of that, but they are. They are going to go look. And you want that messaging to be direct because you want people to understand what they're putting their name on when they're sending an automated direct message. And you also, if you can, want to make it customizable. So this gets a little technical into the tools, but there's a feature in, for instance, the phone to action advocacy tools, where the letter that you have someone send an elected official can be locked. And it's just, that's the letter you send or you don't send. There's another option though in the back of phone to action that allows you to allow audience members to make customized edits to each of the letters. So if I come in as Nick Dean and I see this letter and I have more to say to this elected official, I would be able to add that. On the back end of the tool, there are some really great features where it would allow you to review those before allowing them to go through, or you can just have them send through directly. So it's not giving away complete control. And I think you would want to make a decision as an organization or as a campaign how involved in the review process you'd want to be. But making it customizable means that I get to take some ownership in this work. You've done some legwork for me and some work for me in giving the direct messaging, but allowing it to be customizable means I get to take part in this and add my own voice as well. Finally, you want to give concrete direction to advocates and targets. So it has to be really clear. You have to hit me over the head with what you want me to do. Humans get distracted on the internet every couple seconds. You don't have much time to keep people's attention. And so you do really want to be giving concrete direction to your advocates and to the targets of what we're looking for and why we want you to do what we're doing. And then keep people updated. If I take action online, I want to know how it went. You know, if I made a comment on a policy, if I told an elected official that I supported a bill or I didn't support a bill or I asked for something, one of the best ways to build a relationship with me as someone who's took a simple action as doing an online step is to hear back that, hey, your voice mattered, this thing changed, or you know what, we lost this, but it was so important that we had your voice and we're going to need it going forward as we continue to do this work. Not updating people and not keeping people updated is not a best practice. And it's not just because it ends a story early, but it's also because when you come back to that person, they may remember, I took this action I never knew on this other thing and I never knew what happened. So you are building a relationship. You want to make sure that relationship includes you giving updates on the work that you're working on. I see there's something in the chat. I just want to make sure, Ali, if there's anything. Okay, yes. Thanks, Kathy. Yes, that is also a really good point on customization. Having the exact same copy in all of the emails can be a big flag for spam as well. So that's a really great point. Thank you for that. Okay, so I want to go through an example of some work that was done by Greenpeace USA. They were working on advocacy against a pipeline that was being built, and they had in the Pacific Northwest. And so they were doing everything they could to get this pipeline stopped. That's what the organization wanted. And so what you're seeing here is a couple examples of an email. On the left, it's a topper of an email, and on the right is what was below it, of one of their emails asking people to sign a petition to pressure the governor to not support the building of the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline. And I want to show these examples. So this is just kind of to give you some background here. This pipeline was being built and was going to affect people in Washington. So their target was Governor Inslee at the time. They had a petition that they were driving to get your name added to this petition that they were going to deliver to Governor Inslee against this. And they give you a lot of detail here. One thing I want to say is that Greenpeace has a different list than some other organizations, in that the list really responds well to a lot of detail, a lot of background. They want to know all of it. They've found that over time, more detailed, longer emails work for them. I'm using this as an example just to kind of show as a case study of good writing and good content practices, but don't think that all of your emails have to be as long as Greenpeace emails. This is just a good example and has a couple of the types of things we were just talking about. So on the left here is an email, and I want to give everyone a couple minutes to read through this, and then I'm going to point out a couple of the places that this email follows the best practices we just talked about. So this email says, "Friend, did you see the news? This week, Kinder Morgan announced that it's temporarily suspending non-essential activity on its dirty tar sands project that was threatening to wreak havoc across our region. They specifically named opposition to the pipeline from British Columbia and said that without big changes before the end of May, the pipeline could be shelved for good. I can't overstate just how big this is. Ending this pipeline once and for all is within our reach." So I'll let you read the next couple paragraphs, and then as you're reading them, on the right, be looking for these 3 best practices. I'll give everyone a couple minutes. All right. Don't worry if you're still reading. It's going to show up here on the next slide. So first up, emphasize exactly what the action will accomplish. I believe we can take this across the finish line if we continue applying pressure through the people-powered resistance. We need political leaders to stand strong against this disastrous pipeline, right? So very clearly saying that ending this pipeline is within our reach, and that you doing this will help that. And you want to draft direct messaging and make it customizable. So it says we're asking directly, call Governor Jay Inslee to thank him and ask him to continue standing with us against the pipeline. And this is how you reach his office, and you're going to hear a recording from us and recommendations, and then you're going to be patched through. So not only was it just very clear of what I'm about to expect when I call this phone number, whereas if it just said call his office, it's like, is someone going to pick up? What's going to happen? If you got an automated voice right after that, you may hang up thinking that you got the wrong number or that it's just an answering machine. Knowing what's coming on the other side of this action is really important to make sure that people completed it. And then giving that concrete direction to advocates and target. Call, this is the one thing I want you to do. It wasn't call, email, text, post on Facebook, any of that. It was very direct. Right now we want phone calls. And I think this was intentional. They could have made other requests, and I think they decided this was the thing that they wanted most people to do in that moment. And they were very clear about it, and they were able to give instructions about just that one ask to make it a little bit more impactful and clear for everyone. Are there any questions about the practices here? If there are, feel free to put them in the chat. Great. So next I want to talk a little bit about calendar. We've talked about content best practices, but calendaring is also really important. So calendaring allows you to be strategic. Which action is the most important for this group to take? How do you keep people engaged and informed when there might be a few updates during that time? And it gets more complicated when you add in fundraising or rapid response. So calendaring, if you know kind of the process of your campaign and where you're headed, you might realize, all right, September, we're not going to have a ton that we can do with advocates. Like, we're just getting started. There's no hearing or anything happening. It's a pretty slow season. Let's focus on education and awareness. Let's do some storytelling around why this issue is important. Let's lay it out why we care about this. Let's let people know what this group is all about. Let's think of all the things that we need to get kind of out of the way to bring people along with us. And then you may think, okay, October is going to be incredibly busy. We're going to have a hearing, then it's going to move to this, and then it's going to move to that, and then we're really going to be done. So in October, we're in rapid response mode, following and kind of responding to where we're at. Calendaring can be incredibly important because if there is downtime, you can take advantage of it to be building your list in preparation for the active time. And I talked about this a little bit earlier, but bringing people along. When we think about how 16% of people are opening our emails, we need to bring people along several times. We need to be continually telling that story and kind of surround sound on social and on email, letting people know why this issue is important, why we're working on it, what's coming, and why they need to be a part of it. I put here that it gets more complicated when you add in fundraising and rapid response, because there are just times where end of year for nonprofits is a big fundraising space. There's Giving Tuesday and then just tax benefits of giving at the end of the year. So it can be crowded. So if there's a fundraising goal you have around that same time, getting out ahead of it and thinking through that. And then rapid response, things are going to happen that you just didn't anticipate. I know that some of the pipeline work we just talked about, there were a lot of unexpected twists and turns in the actual development and pausing of the construction of that pipeline that they had to be able to be nimble and respond to. So you can't be so strict with calendaring that you just have it planned out months in advance. You just have to realize, okay, where is our downtime going to be, and how do we think about bringing our advocates along with us? And that leads me to my next point, which is that we should always be thinking in our calendar about advocates. How often have they heard from you? What do they know and not know? What have you told them and not told them? But also, what's happening in the culture that you're working in? This is incredibly important. We have all felt national moments, international moments. The pandemic is a great example that just utterly shift the lens with which everything is viewed and read in. You need to be on the pulse of that. You don't want to set it and forget it and be putting out content, even if it's something as important on your advocacy campaign, without the lens of what's actually happening. So thinking about your advocates, who are they? What are their lives like? Is there something major that's happened in this community? Not just at a national, international level, but in this community. That means we need to change how we're talking about something, or we need to change our approach or even our whole calendar and not send right now. Always something to be considering, so that your online program doesn't do more damage to the campaign than good. I see some chats popping up. Yeah, so this one question around best days and times to send action alerts. There isn't, I got this request from Jerry, thanks for sending it. There really isn't a best day and time. And this is something that I get asked a lot. And time again, this has been tested by different data groups and others. There are probably bad times like holidays or things like that where you'll see a decrease, but there isn't like send Wednesday at noon and you will always get the best results no matter what. What we've actually seen is that emails over time kind of all perform the same, and it's more about the content and what you're sending than it is the day of the week. So obviously, though, if something is happening on Wednesday, let's take like Giving Tuesday, for example. Giving Tuesday is a day on Tuesday. Is that the name of it? Yes. And so you wouldn't want to be sending on a different day than that. But other than that, that's very time-bound and specific to the campaign. Most organizations don't actually see a perfect day and time that work. It's much more dependent on the content. So, thanks for asking that. So a part of the calendar that a lot of people don't remember is that when you first join, it is the most important part of your calendar for your advocates, right? They just did something. If they just signed up for your email list or just took their first action, you want them to be having the experience on the left, not the experience on the right. Your organization wants to be saying, thank goodness you're here, not just staring at you and saying nothing. So when we welcome new advocates, we can do this in a couple ways. Email is one of the easiest ways to welcome new advocates to your list. What you can do is set up what we call a welcome series of emails. So from a content perspective, these are 2 to 3 email sends that all new advocates to your list to get before they get kind of thrown into your full list of sends. This is the first impression you're making after someone's taken action with you. It's where you can help bring them along the story and get them up to speed on the work. It's where they can kind of get to know your campaign or your organization and what you're all about. It's also how they can get connected to other things. If someone just took action with you, they're obviously really primed and interested in what you're doing. And so a welcome series done well can really help long-term keep your advocates active and engaged. Those 2 to 3 sends are often paced at different times. I've seen some welcome series that's every day. It's once a day for 3 days right after someone signs up. I've seen others that span over a week. I would say if you have a large enough list to test, you can test, but if you don't, I would do what's right. Most of the time, the organizations that I work with are doing welcome series over about a week and a half. And what will happen is they'll have one automatic email that says, thanks so much for taking action. We're really glad you're here. This is what we're all about. And then they'll send an email 2 or 3 days later automatically using their email tool that says, hey, by the way, we also have a Facebook or a Twitter or an Instagram account. Make sure to check us out over there as well so you get the most up-to-date information about what's going on. Right after that, they may send a survey. Hey, can you answer these 3 questions? We want to get to know you a little bit better. Or they might ask for donations. So it can really differ by the actions you're driving to, that ladder of engagement I talked about earlier. But in general, a welcome series is one of the best practices you can do from a content and calendaring perspective to help all new advocates have a similar experience and also make sure you're keeping your message and your onboarding experience the same so that everyone, when you start thinking about what your list knows and doesn't know, you know who's received the welcome series and who's kind of seen that information. This is an example of 2 emails in a welcome series from a group called Dig Deep. They had a report on the water gap in America. And so the one on the left is a thank you for signing the petition, and has a very simple messaging graph followed by a link to download the full report. And then, sorry, let me just adjust my screen really quick. The one on the right was a longer form one that went 2 or 3 days later that asked anybody who downloaded to actually donate to Dig Deep. So an example here on the left and right of 2 different emails sent over a period of time to kind of welcome and get advocates to take more action. So I wanted to ask if you've ever noticed if an organization had a welcome series and if that worked for you, if it was helpful. Just put in the chat. I think it'd be helpful to read over time to see how people have noticed or not noticed organizations. I think you'll be surprised by how attuned we are to some of the organizations and how well they've treated us and thought about us and realized that we needed information. So our last set here today is about people. Your list, the people who are helping you take action. So a couple things, best practices to think about here with your people is the first is that you really want to get as much information as you need to do personalization well. And I write this as you need because there is a balance here. If you're running a really quick campaign, and let's say it's statewide in Texas, and you're only going to be talking about at a state level, what's going on, and for some reason you don't need to know like the zip code or city this person lives in, and it's just a really quick online campaign for like signing a petition or doing something. I'm just making this up hypothetically. That would tell me like really your sign up form needs to have email and state. Those are the 2 things you need to know about them. You can sometimes include first name because people want to see their first name and take action there. But if you're doing something really quick, you could be on the lighter end there. Most of the time, though, that's not the case. Campaigns are pretty sophisticated. They're wanting to be more personalized, and when you want to be more personalized, you need to know more. You want to know location. You could maybe get down to the zip code level. You might want to know interest or past actions, and there's a couple ways we could go about that. Interest, I talked a little bit about including a survey and a welcome series. That's a place where you could find out your list interest. Maybe you ask a 3-question survey to your advocates to say, are you interested in phone banking, text message banking, coming out to an event when those are back and happening again, or donating? And you can have that tag your different advocates in the back end of your system so that you can actually pull everyone who said, hey, they're interested in phone banking, or hey, this is everyone who said they would want to do a text message bank. The other thing you can know about your audiences is the past actions that they took. This is where those tools we talked about at the beginning become really important. So if you can see, okay, this person has opened every single email I've ever sent, and maybe they've taken action on every single petition, I'd call that person a super online supporter. Maybe there's something we want people like that to be able to do. Maybe we want to invite them to a personal Facebook group or a Zoom call to learn more, or maybe we want to send those people a personalized ask to be a volunteer leader or something like that. Looking at the information you have about your list can help you make things that are good for them, that they're interested in, and it can tell you things that maybe you didn't realize. So I'd always think about what you want to be able to track, that wish list of things you want to know about your list, and make sure that your forms and your tools and things are set up to be able to know those things. And it's not just about keeping a list, it's about actually tracking it and using it, right? When you start building a list, let's say you have a 6-month campaign, 3 months in, what does our list look like? Where do they live? How many actions have they taken? What's worked, what hasn't worked? If you have the data, but you don't use it to inform your campaign strategy, it's not as helpful. But as you start to get that data about your audiences and your list, it can help you make informed decisions along the way and help drive that change that you're going for. So that's that learn as you go mentality of, you might not have at the beginning, your form only had email on it and you realize, wow, we really need to know where these people live. Let's add zip code to our sign up form. And also let's make sure that we send a survey to people we don't have zip codes for and ask them simply, can you fill this out and let us know? We want to give you personalized information. You won't get 100% completion rate, but you'll definitely get something. And so you can always kind of learn as you go, oh, there's things that we need to know, but honestly, it's better to think through that now at the start of your campaign or your work. And set up everything to work accordingly. I wanted to show that building an engaged list is also really hard. So this is also from M&R's benchmark reports. On the left, and it's broken down by both like topic area and size of lists for nonprofits. But you'll notice having people who've taken 1 or more online actions, pretty good numbers here and there, but some still pretty low. But 3 or more online actions, the numbers tank, right? And so just an example that having super supporters online that consistently take online action takes a lot of work and is really hard. And so you're gonna have a lot of list churn, and you wanna be thinking about, can you make a surround sound great experience to bring these people along so that you can really drive that 3+ online actions work if you are doing a longer term campaign. A couple things to consider when you're building your list. You might inherit a list or have a list that you've been running, but now you come in and you're starting to focus on email pretty full scale now. You might want to do what we call a re-engagement campaign. So let's say you've got 10,000 people on an email list you just inherited for this campaign. But only 2,000 of them are opening their emails. So we've got 8,000 people who haven't opened an email in the past 6 months. What you would actually do is take those 8,000 non-openers and create a series of emails for them and start to figure out how you could re-engage. Maybe you send them an email that says, hey, this campaign's going to be relying a lot more on email. We just want to make sure you're there. Like, click here if you want to keep getting our emails. Or maybe you send them something else that can re-engage them in some way. I have this example from the New Yorker. Apparently I wasn't opening their emails enough. And they finally sent me this and said, do you still want emails from us? We noticed that you haven't opened a newsletter from the New Yorker in a while. Do you still want them? If so, click this button. The reason they're doing this is because over time, non-openers and unengaged activists or advocates on your list actually bring all your percentages down. So if you keep them on your list, but they haven't opened something in 1 or 2 years, they need to be scrubbed off your list because over time, your percentages are just going to go down. If you started with 1,000 people and 500 of them were active, but now you've got 5,000 people and, 4,500 of them aren't active, but they're and 3,000 of them haven't opened an email in 2 years. Well, you don't actually have 5,000 people on your email list, right? Because they're not opening anything and they haven't opened anything in 2 years. So let's be realistic about our list size so that our percentages reflect where we are. It can be really easy to think about list size and think, I just need as many people as possible on this list. That's not true. We need as many active people as possible on this list to really drive change. So it can feel hard to want to scrub the list and do what we call list hygiene, but it's really important to make sure that your numbers are accurate. The other thing you can do to replace churn, because I talked a little bit, you are going to lose people from your program, is digital advertising to reach new people. So you can buy ads across social media platforms, online, YouTube, Google, things like that to bring in new folks, or other growth strategies, events, partner promotion, working with others to promote what's going on and get them added to your list. When you're doing this and you're replacing your list, basically, you're trying to build your list again. A couple things to remember. One is you probably want to target locations for your upcoming needs. Where are new campaigns happening? Where have you seen areas with really good engagement on your list? Maybe it's about water and it's not about animal rights if you're working on a bunch of different things. Look for places where you need to grow and then pair that with your digital advertising or growth strategies so that your list starts to look more like the audiences you're really trying to talk to. And then again, remember to welcome these people. So maybe you inherited a list like I talked about and they haven't been super active and you're building from the beginning. It's so much easier to make sure your welcome series is in place, your survey, or those data you're taking in about them is all ready to go before you're investing in digital advertising or growth, so that they are having a better experience. You know more about them and can talk to your audience effectively and run a more effective advocacy campaign. Okay, well, I think we're right where we want to be in terms of questions. So I'll stop sharing my screen and I'm happy to take any questions, Ali, that we might see.
Yeah, Nick, we have one from Julia McCarthy. She asks, is there a good way or framework to track who is new and your outreach to them? We haven't done this before given technology and capacity, but we are interested.
Yeah, so to track who's new, so most tools will know if they're new. So for instance, if you've got an email list and you're using your tool, and let's say you're using phone to action, this is one that I know pretty well. If someone comes in and they take an action and the email address that they're taking that action with has never been in your system before, they're going to be flagged as a new advocate. And then what you can do is take that flag, that kind of tag on them, and say, all new advocates, I want to send X, Y, and Z emails through. So your system would know if they've ever seen that advocate before. This can get tricky sometimes because people use the same email as two people or other things. So there are some small use cases, but in general, the tool will do that for you. And for instance, every action, an email tool I talked about, you can set up a welcome series for all new emails that join a list. You can also set up a welcome series for all emails that get tagged with something new. So if I set up a petition to say, support policy A, on the back end of my tool, I can say, make sure you put everybody who filled out this petition, put a tag of policy A supporter on their record. And then what I can do is also set up a welcome series that says, anybody who's new to the policy A tag, send them this email, then this email, then this email. So I hope that makes sense, but your tools will often do this. And if it's something you really want to do with your advocates, it's super important to ask the tool vendor that you're working with, do you have automated or automated series or welcome series, which are things that some people call them drip campaigns too. Do you have that capability for us to set up and allow new advocates to get a certain number of emails over a certain number of days?
Quick follow-up to that, Nick. What are the options if folks don't have access to an email management platform or software?
Well, I will say it kind of depends on your campaign, but I talked about Action Network earlier. They actually, I believe, offer some free tools to campaigns. So you could do that. The other thing is you could manage this all using like a Google spreadsheet and then sending out emails. There's some rules there, some legality things there, but if people have opted in to receive emails from you, you'll be okay. I would say that there are some low cost or free ones out there that I would look into, including the ones I mentioned today.
Thanks, Nick. We have a question from Kathy Coe. What do you think the limit is for sending emails to your supporters? I know some people will stop following or unsubscribe from campaigns when they send too many emails.
Yeah, I get this question a lot. It's a really good one. I think that the limit is if the emails don't provide value, people will stop paying attention. Some people are just going to go away. They thought they were interested and they're not, or they're no longer interested, or they're clearing out their inbox, they're too stressed, whatever. And that's not completely your fault as a campaign. What I always recommend the organizations I work with is to really just make sure that what you're sending is something you would want to receive. And we're going to talk about this in the email writing session, but it's really important that it's valuable. If it's urgent, if it's valuable, if there's a clear kind of what we call theory of change of why you're sending this, you're good. You should be sending that email. In terms of number, you do also want to be thoughtful. That doesn't mean if you can if you can write 7 great emails, you should send them back to back to back over a span of 3 hours, right? So you want to be a little bit more thoughtful there. But in general, I don't know that there's just a number that you can think of. I think it would be a little bit about thinking about what do we need to say? How many emails do we need to say it in? And what feels like a good pace? And sometimes that's 1 a day. Sometimes that's 1 every other week. It really just depends. I've definitely worked on a lot of campaigns where we sent a planned email on Monday afternoon, something major breaking happens on Monday that's super important to the campaign, and we send them an email Monday night. The thing about it is that your audience, if the email makes it clear why this was important, why we had to email you right now, they're not going to be as bothered. If there was no real urgency and no real reason, then I really think that you shouldn't send it, right? Like there should have to be a reason, and that can help you kind of gauge your frequency. More often than not, the organizations I work with send too little rather than too less because they get worried about oversaturating or overwhelming lists. We all get really annoyed at our email inbox, but there are still good emails out there that we read. And so what you want to remember is that 16% on average of people that you sent that last email to read it, which means a lot of people haven't actually heard from you, even though you think they have.
We have something in the same vein, but I want to touch on it from Haley. What are the best practices for the number of action items you're sending or asking of supporters over time? Are people more likely to stay engaged with frequent action items, or does that lead to them getting burnt out?
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer really. I think that this gets back to the ladder of engagement question. Some of us are going to max out with our organizations. Like, I gave to you once, I sent 1 petition, and that's kind of all I wanted to do. And so I think that some people just have their own personal burnout levels, and other people are just more engaged. I think that you probably want to check this from the data. So it would be a thing about your own list. I'm just kind of thinking on the fly, like, if let's say you have a list that maybe you work for an organization that's consistently doing advocacy, maybe try to figure out where's the drop off. Is it 3 actions? Is it 4 actions over time where we just see people start unsubscribing, or is it not? If they start taking 3 actions, they're more likely to stay. It's really a data question to kind of look to see how things are performing. But I also think the value point comes back here as well. You don't want to just ask them every single day to tweet something new, because then you're engaging them a lot and they'll stay. You want it to be valuable. And every time that it's valuable and you can make me feel like I was a part of this campaign in a real way, I think that you're more likely to keep people more engaged than to burn them out.
And to add on to that, Betsy has a comment in the chat saying, I think it's important that you ask people to do meaningful activities. So make sure they know what they're doing is moving their issue forward. And I would agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I need to be told, and I need to be told it, because like we have a campaign strategy often and we know it, but you have to tell it to the people you want to bring into the campaign to say, you got to call the governor right now because they're deciding whether or not they're going to do X thing. And it's actually really important that people who live here are telling the governor X, Y, and Z. And they are listening, and this will matter. I think reminding people, encouraging them is really important, and making sure that it's meaningful. So
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more. So I'll go to Mark's question. Is there a platform or program that is best for sending out text messages? communicating with lawmakers, we found that they're more likely to respond to constituents or volunteers if they text them as opposed to email.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it sounds like, Mark, what you're saying is that people are sending text messages to the lawmakers directly. Is that right? If is that what you're saying?
Yep.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess it's similar to the example of calling the governor's office. More often than not, I've worked in the texting advocates directly and having them do actions rather than having the advocates text the kind of target or the point of the representative or anything like that more. But in terms of tools, I'll say if you're doing digital advocacy in general, I know phone to action is great because it has both digital advocacy and SMS. Simple texting is great for more broadcast messaging. Hustle, and I think there's a tool called Relay, are both peer-to-peer messaging where you're doing that more peer-to-peer. And so maybe you would send a message to say, hey, text this number and let Representative so-and-so know that you want them to do X, Y, and Z thing. But there's a ton out there in terms of getting them to take action via text message. There's a lot of text messaging tools out there. And I think just vetting that it does the things you want to do is really important.
Probably the last one we'll be able to get to, but I'll go to Jerry. He asks, are there any thoughts on how you approach balancing specific campaign needs versus organizational list building needs when they may conflict? For example, requiring phone numbers and action alerts, asking people to email their lawmaker to grow the number of people we can engage via text, but maybe losing people not comfortable giving their phone number and generating less emails to the lawmaker.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So this comes down to strategy, and I think it's why the team working on this should have that conversation early. Like, if it's really important that we get phone number and it's critical to our campaign strategy, then we should include it. But also, how do we bring other people along the way? Can we include a link on our page that says, if you're only interested in giving us your email, fill out this form? Or can we make those use cases if we're worried about that? So in terms of that specific example, I think there are some conversations that just need to be had. Why do we need phone number? How do we think we're going to use it? Same for email. Why do we need their email? How are we going to use it? That's a big way for you to cut form fields to say like, oh, we're actually never going to use zip code, right? And if you can come up with a plausible use case in the future, you might want to keep it in there and maybe make it non-required or something else. The other thing I'll say is, on the question around approaching balancing specific campaign needs versus the full organization, this is where those segments become really important. So if you can segment a group out and say, okay, we're running a campaign in Texas, we're a national organization, but we're running a campaign in Texas, let's move all our Texas people to this list and create an entire calendar and set of content for them. They're not going to get our main messaging for a while, and that's okay. Right, and having that conversation to say like, this is a priority for this group of people, and so that can help you balance, because rather than, it's common to think you have to talk to the whole list all the time about the same thing, but segments allow you to really talk specifically to different audiences within your list with the right messaging that's important to the organization, and that can help balance some of those competing needs.
Thanks, Nick. And thank you everyone for attending. We're almost at time. I just want to put a quick plug in for part 2 of the digital advocacy email training, where we'll do a deeper dive into email. That will be on August 12th, 2020. And Annie just pasted a registration link in the chat. Thank you again for attending, and we hope to receive your feedback as well.
Thanks, everyone.